You have moved from solar energy and home retrofits to urban technology and real estate. What key insight from your early work in energy has influenced how you now approach city scale development?
Yeah, so I mean, starting off in my career in energy was super interesting for me because everything in the built environment, if you trace it back far enough, it goes all to energy. And this is like true all throughout time, basically. So if you go back to before we even had cities and before we were even settled and before people lived in homes and we were nomadic and we were hunter gatherers, the level of energy that society was able to have was very limited, right? It was just like the food we were able to collect and gather. And then we sort of invented agriculture and we had all this energy from food. And then we were able to settle into towns and we build permanent housing and everything, and that's sort of when the idea of the home or the house started because we stay in one place because you have to do the farming. And then, we had many revolutions of energy, and sort of the famous one is like the Industrial Revolution with coal, and this was like this massive um, influx of new energy, right? And it created all these industrial cities and all this urbanization and sort of the modern idea of the city. And then we had oil and gas, and that created this massive explosion of urbanization. And so we live in this world of cities that was really built up in waves of energy. And so I basically got to start my career like thinking about how every home uses energy and then how the energy that is produced. And when we think about, for example, solar panels, like I was selling to homeowners, you're actually producing the energy that your home is using, right? And so it helped me understand that we're going through a major shift in energy, and that's actually changing the way we're going to build cities, and it's thinking like changing the way we even think of urban communities and how they function. So it was very formative for me. And then like on the more practical side, that's like I love the theory stuff, so I like to talk about that. But on the practical side of things, it was like really interesting to think of my career as starting out in I would say sustainability practices in the built environment. That's obviously been a big wave of professional focus for a lot of people in the built environment. How do we make our assets more, efficient in terms of operation? How do we make them less impactful to the environment in terms of the actual materials that we use and produce? And now, sort of at the urban scale and development, we have to think about those things at a much larger scale. And you think about when you're building thousands of homes or hundreds of homes, or millions of square feet of real estate in a development, the impact of that is really substantial. And so understanding those things from first principles allows you to, at the higher levels, have a project that's really, um, we use the word sustainable. It's a buzzword. There's different degrees of sustainability. But if we want to push towards a society or a world where our built environments are genuinely sustainable, we have to start somewhere and we have to start sort of building up. So I would say it's even still early stage, even though people have been talking about sustainability for a long time. It's been a lot of greenwashing and it's been a lot of buzzwords and so on. But now we're starting to really see, developers in particular get really serious about how can we think about our emissions properly? How can we think about creating genuinely efficient buildings and using AI and technology and data in the systems, the MEP systems and so on, to create these genuinely sustainable buildings that, are adaptive to the environment and adaptive to the users. So they're super efficient. So I think we're on the cusp of a really cool era where we can use technology to implement a lot of the things that I've been thinking about for years, having, sort of started out in that initially.
In your experience, how data and systems thinking shape better outcomes in urban design and development?
Yeah, so look, I studied cities at a little research institute in Barcelona, studied cities and technology, and we were really thinking of urban ecosystems. And I carried that forward when I went to MIT and studied real estate development specifically. And I was doing research there at MIT on the intersection of technology and cities. And the key element of that research for me, I think the main lesson there is that you have to think in terms of systems in order to understand things properly when you're working in the built environment, because the built environment is legitimately a system. it's many systems. It's super complicated, obviously. And so I would actually even say the most relevant field for people working in the built environment who are interested in understanding what's going on from first principles is um, complexity science and thinking about complex systems, because cities really are like quintessential complex systems. And when you make that realization, it forces you to sort of zoom out and think about what are the most like the largest, most integrated, most fundamental systems that the other systems are nested within. So if you think about it like in just in terms of a building is a little system, right? And it has all kinds of different technologies and equipments, and it has different purposes and different uses, but it's one piece of a community, which is sort of one area of a city, which is sort of one area of the larger built environment that really spans across all cities. And that actually is one system that spans the entire planet. And that system operates within the complex system of the biosphere itself. So the biosphere of the Earth is actually the sort of largest system within which the built environment is operating. And so thinking from that level, it sounds really abstract, but I think that in reality, the systems thinking approach forces you to go back to first principles, which forces you to go back to actually the biosphere as a system. And by the way, when we talk about sustainability, that really is a matter of talking about the functioning of the biosphere and making it so that our cities and our buildings and our construction ecosystems function in a healthy way in relationship to the systems of the biosphere. That's really what we're talking about when people say sustainability. What they mean is we want to be able to live in our cities in a high quality of life indefinitely without in some way fundamentally disturbing or catastrophically disturbing the biosphere, right? Because we depend on those systems, the systems of energy coming in from the sun, the systems of gases, the balance of gases in the atmosphere. When people talk about global warming, that's all they're talking about, right? So I think if in order to understand sustainability and in order to think about um, real estate development in a really integrated way, you have to understand the largest systems at play, which is the level of the biosphere. And then that allows you to go down and down and down to the system level of the property that you're building. And that property has materials that are coming from the earth and energy that's coming from the sun that's been converted in some way. So I think that, I don't know, that's like, I accept that I think about these things in a somewhat unusual way. And I talk to my peers or my colleagues and I think I'm a little bit crazy. But in reality, I do believe that this way of thinking is the only way to have an integrated alignment between principles of sustainability, principles of technological change over time, and the actual, practical elements of the individual projects that you might be working on.
With rapid urban growth across the Middle East, how do you see AI and digital tools helping developers and city planners build more sustainable and efficient communities?
Yeah, look, I part of the reason why I came to the Middle East to practice in the real estate development field is because Europe and the US and a lot of other places, Far East Asia and so on, these places are very mature in terms of their development. There's not a ton of growth, and the cities are established, and most of it is built, and a lot of what's going on is redevelopment of existing properties. So, in the case of where you're located there in Europe, the cities are very beautiful, they're very well established, but they're not growing tremendously, right? And so, in terms of the real estate development profession that I'm in, we're in the business of changing and growing the built environment. And so, from my perspective, if you want to be in where the action is, you got to be where the growth is. And so, MENA and Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, that's really where all the that region is really driving the global total net urban growth. And so that's where most of the real estate development activity is. And so I see that as the sort of it's the domain where you can have the largest impact in terms of understanding how we can use technology and technological tools to impact uh, urban development. Because if you change urban development in New York and London and other cities like that, it has an effect, but it's It's actually really a rounding error on the total amount of urban growth that's actually happening in the world. And all of that urban growth is happening sort of in the region that Dubai is in the center of. And so the opportunity to apply new technologies and new tools in the development industry here, I think has really strong ripple effects across the entire region and has a great impact. So by the way, I also think that when you have an impact in a very impactful region, then other places start to pay attention to what works, right? We oftentimes, I think maybe in like I'm American, obviously, and in America, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we just sort of export all the ideas to the world and that other places just copy America. You can fall into this trap in Europe too. But what's happening, I think what we're seeing on the ground now is that developers in MENA, in Riyadh and in Dubai and other places, what they are doing and what they are proving works on big, influential, important projects is now being re-exported back to Europe and to the US and to other places. So I do think that we're in a bit of a spotlight here, and that if we can get things to work on some of these really interesting, high profile projects, it also has a very positive effect on the rest of the world. So the tools we use, the processes that we employ, the types of innovation that we are willing to take a risk on, and just the risks inherent in building big, in some cases very massive real estate projects. So you look at the scale of the projects that are being built here, and you take TrueBuild, for example, being based in Riyadh because of all these massive, massive projects. Nobody is building real estate projects anywhere in the world at the scale that's happening in Riyadh and elsewhere in Saudi and Dubai and elsewhere around the region. So yeah, I think it's a very exciting place to try and apply these tools, and it becomes like a proving ground, which is why it makes a ton of sense for companies like TrueBuild to be based in the kingdom.
Your background includes direct work with homeowners before stepping into broader strategic roles. How has that shaped the way you think about the end user experience in urban projects?
Yeah, so when I started my career, I was selling, products to homeowners. And so it's very personal for people because it's their home, it's their personal money, it's their livelihoods. And every dollar really counts in those situations. And you get a very visceral understanding of the fact that, what are people willing or not willing to pay for? And that has sort of really stuck with me because at the end of the day, a big development firm, for example, it's building a massive mixed use communities. These are billions of dollars worth of real estate that needs to be sold into the market, and each one of those sales pays back an increment of the massive investment that was put forward in the development project. And so we always sort of have to be going back to asking ourselves, what are people actually willing to pay for? So for example, when I was at MIT, the MIT Center for Real Estate has done a lot of research on sustainability and in commercial real estate specifically. And people might be familiar with the idea of a green premium, meaning that if a product is sustainable or provably sustainable, that people might be willing to pay more for it. Or the question is, are they willing to pay more for it, right? And the evidence shows, to my understanding so far, shows that this sort of starting to exist in markets in Europe, maybe starting to exist a little bit in certain markets in the US. So for example, if you're in Copenhagen, there might be a green premium that exists. In other words, a consumer is willing to pay more for the space that they occupy simply because it's sustainable, right? Whereas that doesn't exist everywhere. Like in Dubai, it's not true. Like people just really don't care. It's not that they don't care about sustainability. It's just that the question is, how much more are they willing to pay just because they know something is sustainable? And the answer is pretty much zero. Now, that might change, but my point with saying all of that is just to make the point that like you always have to think of like what is really important to people, because especially when it comes to residential space, this is a matter of where people live. It's where they raise their children, and it's very personal to them, and it's oftentimes a very large portion of their hard-earned money that they pay to occupy that space, whether in a mortgage or a rental contract. So it's all very personal. And I think anytime, I work at the intersection of technology and real estate development. So I'm really involved in like innovation. And the question always becomes, if it costs us X amount of money to do some innovation in our property, are people actually willing to pay for that innovation at the end of the day? Or is this just something flashy that we're doing because we want the marketing, and so on and so forth? So, it's always a bit of a balance, but I would say that's something that's sort of a pragmatic view around innovation that I sort of have carried with me since my very early days working individually one-on-one with homeowners.
Looking ahead, what do you believe will define the next generation of cities, and how can the construction and real estate sectors prepare for that shift?
Yeah, so when we talk about what might define the next generation of cities, this is really where I get excited. This is like the intersection of all the things I'm interested in. And look, I will just rant for 30 seconds on some of my philosophical background because at MIT, I was working on research that was basically trying to point out that cities are technology. People don't oftentimes think of that in that way, but it's really true. If you define technology broadly speaking as a means to a purpose or a device or a process or a system that solves some need that we have, that we've invented and we've built in order to solve that need, then in that sense, a house is a technology, a building is a technology, infrastructures like roads or metro systems and so on, those are technologies. And so cities really are these intricate complex networks of technology. And from that perspective, we could say that the technology of the city is starting to evolve in very dramatic ways. And going back to what I was saying earlier about energy, we are now at the cusp of another transition in how we produce and consume energy. And this is really revolves around the electrification of the economy and a shift away from fossil fuels. It's not an immediate thing. Fossil fuels will still be around and will be with us for a very long time, at least I believe. But what we're seeing is on top of the baseline of fossil fuel energy in the economy, we're now beginning to layer on this ever increasing new layer of electrical production. And it's from renewables. And I also do think we have not yet seen the real wave of nuclear power that's going to come. So my thesis around energy and the technology of cities is that over the course of the 21st century, we're going to see a massive increase in the total gross amount of energy produced and consumed in cities. And that's going to result in a whole new wave of urbanization and urban development. So I believe we're at the cusp of the most exciting period ever in urban development. I also think we're at the cusp of the most potentially risk-filled period ever in the development of cities. There's a lot that could go wrong, and we really have to walk this narrow path between extremes, where in the extremes we sort of run into potentially catastrophic risks. And this could be things as well understood as, climate change, or it could be things as sort of obscure as like, super intelligent AI that sort of goes awry in a number of different ways. I'm a huge advocate for AI, but we have to walk a narrow path along these risky technologies. The same thing with like nuclear energy, right? It's this potentially transformative thing that's going to give us all this new energy that we can do all these new interesting things with in construction and so on. But at the same time, also presents a huge risk to humanity for obvious reasons. So there's a narrow path that I believe we can follow. And if we do that, I think we're going to see as you say, a next generation of cities, if you want to frame it that way, that are going to be super exciting, that meet the needs of humans living in them to a degree that previous cities never could, while also, operating in balance with the ecological systems of the biosphere, so that we don't end up, in any sort of sketchy situations with the basic environmental systems that we rely on to extract our energy and our materials and so on. But if we can do that, I think humanity will be extremely well off. I'm really optimistic about the future, but it will require that all of us working in the built environment basically take it very seriously that there are real risks, and that it's incumbent upon us as professionals in the built environment to take technological development super seriously, and to do it in the right way, so that we end up walking that narrow path and delivering this really, I wouldn't say it's utopian, it's just a positive vision for the future where cities really serve the needs of humans that live in them, while also sort of remaining in balance with the ecological systems of the biosphere. I think it's possible, and I think it's incumbent upon us all to work towards that.